We don't take sides. We present theories and let you decide. Welcome to Part 4 of our End of the World Deep Dive series. Up until now, we've spent a pretty significant amount of time exploring the what and the how of this whole unfolding conflict.
Right, the tactical side of things.
Exactly. We've looked at the troop movements across the map, the immediate economic fallout that's hitting global markets, and really what all those moving pieces mean for you as you try to navigate this incredibly volatile period. But today, we have a very specific, much more difficult mission. Today, we are unpacking the why.
A big question.
Yeah, the biggest. Why is this war happening at all? Okay, let's unpack this. Because when you look closely, the glaring contradictions are they're absolutely everywhere. The official explanations we are being handed by leadership, they're falling apart at the seams under any serious scrutiny.
They absolutely are. And to understand why military analysts and geopolitical strategists are even asking this question in the first place, we have to look at the facts that prove the current narrative is fundamentally broken. It's not just a matter of public skepticism. It's a matter of institutional red flags. First, you have the public sentiment. 78% of the American public oppose the initial strikes.
Which is huge.
It is a staggering, overwhelming majority. In a functioning democratic system, that kind of unified opposition acts as a massive stop sign for any administration. But it didn't. Then you look at the military brass. The top leadership, and we are talking about the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff here, expressly warned against doing this.
And I want to pause on that point for a second because that feels incredibly significant to me. Usually the stereotype is that the military establishment is, well, they're hawkish, right?
Right, they want the budget.
Exactly. They're the ones pushing for engagement, asking for larger budgets, advocating for the projection of power. But here you have the people whose entire professional existence is dedicated to understanding the grim reality of war, and they were the ones slamming on the brakes.
Precisely. When the generals are the ones telling the politicians that a war is a bad idea, you are in completely uncharted territory. They understand the logistics, the supply lines, the human cost, and then there is the sheer math of the munitions, which we are going to get into in deep detail a bit later. But the short version is the math simply doesn't add up. We are mathematically, financially, and logistically not equipped for this specific type of engagement.
Right, so you have all these massive glaring warning lights flashing red. The public is saying no, the generals are saying no, the math is saying no, and yet the engine just kept revving. The strikes happened anyway.
Exactly. And when rational official explanations fail to explain why an action of this magnitude was taken, that is when military analysts, historians, and investigative journalists start looking for the real underlying drivers. Because things don't just happen for no reason on the global stage. If the strategic reasons presented at the press conferences are empty, the real reasons are usually hidden behind closed doors.
Which brings us to the core framework for today's deep dive. We are going to walk you through 3 incredibly uncomfortable, yet highly credible theories that are currently circulating among top analysts right now. These theories attempt to explain exactly why this war was triggered against all conventional logic. And fair warning, if even one of these theories holds weight, it is going to completely change how you view everything that is happening in the world right now.
It really will reframe the entire picture, because these theories suggest that the traditional rules of how nations operate, how they calculate risk, and how they protect their citizens, they simply aren't applying in this scenario.
Before we get to those hitting theories, though, we need to show you exactly why analysts are looking past the excuses we were given on day 1. We need to walk through the collapse of the official story. Let's look at those initial justifications. First, former President Trump claimed that nuclear talks with Iran had completely failed, and therefore preemptive military strikes were the only viable option left on the table to prevent a nuclear-armed adversary.
Which, to be fair, sounds completely reasonable on the surface.
Right, standard geopolitical logic.
Exactly. If a hostile nation is aggressively building a nuclear weapon and absolutely refuses to negotiate, military action becomes a standard, expected talking point in international relations. We've seen that exact logic applied for decades. But analysts have pointed out a massive problem with that justification in this specific instance. Multiple deep dive reports, citing internal diplomatic channels, indicate that Iran was actually willing to agree to all American terms. The negotiations hadn't failed at all. Behind the scenes, they were reportedly highly successful.
But wait, let me play devil's advocate here for a second. If you are an administration looking for a major foreign policy victory, achieving a comprehensive nuclear deal where the adversary agrees to your terms is a massive political win. Why on earth would they publicly declare it a failure to justify strikes when peace could have been paraded as a huge triumph?
That is the exact question strategists are asking. The theory posits that the administration wasn't actually looking for a diplomatic victory. They were looking for a kinetic one.
The kinetic one, meaning actual combat.
Yes. If your predetermined goal is military engagement, a successful negotiation is actually a massive inconvenience. It removes your justification for war. So according to these reports, the success was quietly buried, and the talks were publicly declared a failure to clear the runway for the strikes.
That is a staggering contradiction. And it wasn't just that one excuse from Trump. We also heard a very different justification from Secretary of State Marco Rubio. His explanation was incredibly specific and honestly a bit confusing. He stated that the United States had to preempt an Israeli strike. The logic, as he laid it out, was that Israel was going to attack Iran anyway, and if Israel did that, Iran would retaliate against both Israel and the United States. So the U.S. had to strike first.
What's fascinating here is the absolute circular logic of that argument. Think about what is actually being said. Striking a country simply because someone else was going to do it, and you are afraid of getting hit in the resulting crossfire, makes zero strategic sense. You are virtually guaranteeing the exact conflict you claim to be trying to avoid.
It's like stepping into a burning building because you are worried someone else might push you in later. You're still on fire. How does that protect American interests?
It doesn't. It defies basic military logic. You don't initiate a massive regional war to avoid the possibility of being dragged into a massive regional war. Analysts look at a statement like that and immediately recognize it as a post hoc rationalization. It's an excuse reverse-engineered to fit an action that was already decided upon for entirely different reasons.
And we want to be very clear with you listening right now. Recognizing these massive holes in the official story isn't conspiracy thinking. It is basic common sense, and it is exactly what intelligence analysts are paid to do. When a friend gives you 3 different conflicting excuses for why they were late to dinner, you naturally assume they aren't telling you the real reason. We are simply inviting you to apply that exact same common sense to global geopolitics.
Precisely. We have to look past the carefully crafted press conferences. If the stated reasons are demonstrably false or logically broken, we have to ask what the unstated reasons are. And that is where the analytical community is currently focused.
Which brings us to the first of our 3 theories trying to explain this mess. Let's look at the psychology of the easy win. The core idea here is incredibly simple, but deeply dangerous. Hubris. The theory suggests that the empire essentially got high on its own supply.
And to really grasp this theory, you have to look at the specific geopolitical catalyst that happened right before this Middle Eastern conflict blew up. We're talking about the recent United States extraction of Nicolas Maduro from Venezuela. Now, for those who haven't followed South American geopolitics closely, you have to understand the context here. Venezuela has been a thorn in the side of U.S. foreign policy for decades. The logistics of operating inside a hostile, deeply entrenched nation are typically a nightmare. But this operation, it was a masterclass in modern military execution.
Paint a picture for us. What made it such a masterclass? Because special operations happen all the time.
They do, but rarely with this level of high-stakes precision against a sitting head of state. It was quick, it was incredibly clean, and it was highly successful. U.S. forces utilized cutting-edge intelligence, seamless coordination between cyber and kinetic units, and flawlessly executed an extraction that left the Venezuelan government entirely paralyzed before they even realized what was happening. They went in, achieved an incredibly difficult objective that many thought was impossible without starting a massive civil war, and got out without getting bogged down in a protracted nation-building exercise.
Think about the adrenaline rush that causes in a war room in Washington. Imagine you're playing a complex strategy video game on the hardest possible difficulty setting, and you somehow beat the final boss flawlessly on your very first try. You suddenly feel like you are completely unstoppable. You start thinking you can do it blindfolded. For U.S. leadership, and specifically for the president, the theory is that this Maduro extraction created an incredibly powerful psychological illusion. It created this blinding belief that the United States military could execute any operation, anywhere on the globe, flawlessly and instantly.
That adrenaline rush is historically one of the most dangerous things a leader of an empire can experience. Because if we connect this to the bigger picture, there is a profound historical pattern here. Easy wins create an invincibility complex, and that complex inevitably leads to fatal miscalculations. History is littered with empires that fell not because they were fundamentally weak, but because they thought they were too strong to fail, and so they overextended themselves catastrophically.
Walk us through some of those historical parallels, because human nature in the war room doesn't really change, does it?
It doesn't. The psychology of power remains incredibly consistent. The most glaring example analysts point to is World War II, specifically regarding Nazi Germany. Hitler conquered Poland, France, and most of Western Europe in a matter of months. The Blitzkrieg, the Lightning War, was so wildly successful, so much faster and easier than anyone in the German high command anticipated, that it created an absolute delusion of invincibility. It was that exact delusion, that high from the easy win, that led him to authorize Operation Barbarossa, the massive invasion of the Soviet Union.
Right, he thought it would just be another quick summer campaign. Roll the tanks in, take Moscow, and be home by Christmas.
Exactly. He thought the Soviet Union would collapse like a house of cards. Instead, it was a grinding, impossible war of attrition across thousands of miles of brutal terrain that entirely destroyed the German army. Or look at Napoleon Bonaparte. Consecutive, brilliant victories across Europe blinded him to the reality of his own limitations. He started to believe his own myth. He believed his tactical genius could overcome geography itself. And that overconfidence directly led to his catastrophic march on Russia, where the winter, the scorched earth tactics of the Russians, and the sheer scale of the logistical operation destroyed his Grande Armée.
So the historical pattern is terrifyingly clear. Easy win, unchecked ego, massive overreach, total disaster.
The easy win is the trap. It teaches you the wrong lessons about your own capabilities.
And that brings us to the massive mismatch in military strategy happening right now in the Middle East. Let's talk about how the U.S. military is actually built, because it plays directly into this hubris theory. The American military apparatus is fundamentally designed for what we call shock and awe. It is built for massive, rapid, overwhelming displays of technological dominance. It is built to roll in, blind the enemy's radar, break their communication infrastructure instantly, and force a surrender through sheer intimidation and overwhelming firepower.
And they are exceptionally good at that. Let's be clear, the U.S. military can deliver shock and awe better than any fighting force in human history. When they want to dismantle a conventional army that is standing in an open field, no one does it better. The problem, however, is that shock and awe only works if the enemy can be shocked and if they can be awed.
Right, but look at the reality of Iran. This is not a country that is going to be shocked by a sudden massive airstrike. This is an enemy that has spent the last 20 years preparing for exactly this specific scenario. They have watched what the U.S. did in Iraq and Afghanistan. They took notes. They aren't lining up tanks on a battlefield to be bombed by F-35s. They are hiding their critical assets deep inside incredibly rugged mountainous terrain. They have buried their nuclear facilities under layers of solid rock. They are motivated by an intense religious and nationalistic fervor that makes psychological intimidation nearly impossible. And crucially, they are utilizing incredibly cheap, highly effective, decentralized warfare, like truck-launched drones and mobile missile batteries.
And that right there is the crux of the hubris theory. Hubris blinds leaders to the vital difference between a quick surgical extraction operation in Venezuela against a crumbling regime and an impossible grinding war of attrition in the Middle East against a deeply entrenched, highly motivated adversary. You simply cannot use a doctrine of shock and awe to defeat 20 years of decentralized preparation. But if you are high on the success of your last easy win, the theory suggests you won't realize that fundamental mismatch until your forces are already bogged down and it is far too late to pull out gracefully.
It is a terrifying psychological trap. The idea that a massive war could be triggered simply because a few guys in a room felt invincible after a successful special ops mission is chilling. But that's only the first theory. Here's where the geopolitical analysis gets incredibly complex and a whole lot darker. Let's move to the second theory. Analysts are floating. Follow the money or the personal calculus. This theory suggests that this war doesn't benefit the strategic interests of the United States at all, but it personally and profoundly benefits the political leadership and their core financial backers.
When official military strategy doesn't make sense, seasoned analysts always say to follow the money. And in this case, the money trail isn't some convoluted conspiracy. It is incredibly wide, publicly documented, and very clearly marked.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's unpack the most staggering number right up front, because it anchors this entire theory. We are talking about a $2 billion investment. That is 2 with 9 zeros. This money flowed straight from the Public Investment Fund, which is the sovereign wealth fund of Saudi Arabia, directly into a newly formed private equity fund managed by Jared Kushner, who is, of course, the former president's son-in-law and a key advisor.
Now, we need to break down what this actually means, because it's easy to just hear $2 billion and think of it as a rich guy getting richer. But you have to understand that in the world of global finance and high-stakes geopolitics, a $2 billion investment from a foreign government into a newly formed private equity fund with virtually no track record isn't a standard financial transaction.
Explain the mechanics of that. Why is private equity the chosen vehicle here, rather than just buying U.S. Treasury bonds or investing in Apple?
That's the key. A sovereign wealth fund is essentially the national savings account of a country, managed by the state. When they move $2 billion into a private equity fund, they aren't just looking for a safe 6% annual return. Private equity is uniquely structured. It is highly unregulated compared to public stock markets. It acts as a black box where money is locked up for years, often a decade or more. The fund manager, in this case Kushner, gets massive, unchecked capital to play with, and they collect massive management fees regardless of how the investments actually perform. According to financial analysts examining this theory, an investment of that scale, structured in that way and given to a close family member of a potential future president, is widely viewed not as an investment in businesses, but as the purchase of a profound, enduring relationship. It is an absolute alignment of personal and national interests.
It's essentially buying a seat at the absolute highest table of American power. It ensures that when Saudi Arabia calls, the White House answers. But wait, let me push back a bit. $2 billion is a massive amount of money to an individual, but for a nation-state like Saudi Arabia, is that really enough to fundamentally alter U.S. foreign policy and buy a war?
According to this theory, it's not just the $2 billion. It's about the leverage that money represents, and it's about combining it with other massive financial incentives. Because the Saudis aren't the only ones buying influence. Analysts point to the second major player here, which is Israel, and specifically the influence of domestic political megadonors. We need to talk about Miriam Adelson. She is a historically massive political donor, deeply tied to Israeli interests. She's been funding Trump's political ambitions for a long time, and according to deeply sourced reports, she allegedly offered $250 million to back his campaign for a third presidential term.
Right. And when you combine the weight of that Saudi sovereign wealth money with the massive domestic campaign finance power of the Israeli lobby, you start to see a very clear picture of who holds the financial leverage over the administration.
Yeah.
And the theory argues that this leverage translates directly into foreign policy.
Exactly. There was a very revealing report published in the Washington Post that highlights this exact dynamic. Now, we should note that this report was strongly disputed by Saudi officials, but it is widely seen by intelligence analysts as an authorized leak from within the U.S. national security apparatus. This report explicitly stated that Saudi Arabia and Israel actively and jointly pushed the administration to launch attacks on Iran.
But hold on, historically, Saudi Arabia and Israel haven't exactly been best friends. They have deep religious and geopolitical divides. Is it really credible that they are suddenly coordinating backroom deals to push the U.S. into a massive regional war? What's the glue holding that incredibly unlikely alliance together?
The glue is the shared existential threat of Iran. Realpolitik often makes for very strange bedfellows. Both Israel and Saudi Arabia view Iran as the primary destabilizing force in the region that threatens their respective survival. So, while they may disagree on almost everything else, the theory suggests they found common ground in using their combined financial leverage to steer U.S. military might toward eliminating their shared enemy.
Which actually makes sense of Saudi Arabia's actions, even if it totally contradicts their public statements. Because publicly, if you watch the United Nations speeches, Saudi Arabia has maintained a very careful, very measured pro-peace stance. They constantly say they want stability and de-escalation in the region.
But actions speak significantly louder than diplomatic words. While they are publicly calling for peace, military tracking shows they are actively allowing their sovereign airspace to be used for United States and Israeli military strikes on Iranian targets. You do not let foreign fighter jets fly through your backyard to bomb your neighbor if you are genuinely committed to staying out of the fight and remaining neutral. They are deeply involved.
Hey, keeping track of all these hidden financial ties, sovereign wealth funds, and backroom political deals is exactly why we do this research independently. It takes a massive amount of time to dig through the financial disclosures and geopolitical reports to bring you this synthesis. If you're finding this deep dive valuable, you can support our work over at buymeacoffee.com, end of the world. The link is right there in the description. Now, let's get back to the theory. We've established the money trail, but what is the domestic endgame here? Because there has to be a reason the political leadership accepts this money and takes on this massive risk.
There is an endgame. And according to political strategists, it involves a terrifying domestic calculus. If you are a leader facing massive domestic opposition, plummeting approval ratings, and a deeply divided country, War has historically been the ultimate distraction. But the theory goes much further than just distraction. If this conflict in the Middle East escalates, and given the dynamics we will talk about how it inevitably might and requires American boots on the ground, that scenario could provide the ultimate legal justification for declaring sweeping emergency war powers.
And for you listening, we need to be really clear about what emergency war powers actually mean in the context of the American government. It's not just a fancy title or a procedural quirk. It fundamentally alters the constitutional fabric of the nation.
Exactly. Emergency powers grant the executive branch extraordinary, almost dictatorial authority. We are talking about the legal ability to seize domestic assets, to control communication networks, and potentially to delay or directly influence federal elections. Furthermore, a major war creates an intense rally around the flag effect. Historically, during a time of severe global crisis, it becomes culturally and politically unpatriotic to criticize the commander-in-chief. For an administration looking to solidify power, this crisis could potentially carve an otherwise impossible unconstitutional path to a third presidential term. If the country is locked in an existential grinding war, the normal rules of democracy are very often suspended in the name of national security.
So, to summarize the financial theory, the war makes absolutely no strategic sense for the American public. But it makes $2 billion worth of sense, plus a potential guaranteed third term for the people pulling the strings. It's a terrifying proposition. But to really understand why Saudi Arabia is willing to write these massive checks and risk massive Iranian retaliation, we have to look closer at their reality. Let's examine the depth of the Saudi desperation. Because this isn't just about regional dominance for them. Analysts argue this is a fight for their absolute survival.
It really is an existential crisis for the House of Saud. To understand the current Middle East dynamic, you have to understand the unique vulnerability of Saudi Arabia. People often group Israel and Saudi Arabia together simply as anti-Iran allies, but their domestic situations are completely different. Israel has an undeclared but widely acknowledged nuclear arsenal, and they have a highly diversified modern tech economy. They build software, medical devices, agricultural tech. They are incredibly resilient to global market shocks. Saudi Arabia, on the other hand, relies almost entirely on one single commodity: oil.
And there is a massive, centuries-old ideological clash happening at the exact same time. Iran is a Shia religious theocracy. It's ruled by clerics who believe they have a divine mandate. Saudi Arabia is a Sunni monarchy, ruled by a royal family whose legitimacy is tied to their stewardship of the holy sites. These two systems inherently despise each other. They view each other as illegitimate. And Iran hasn't just been sitting quietly across the Gulf. They have spent decades actively funding, training, and arming hostile proxy groups right on the Saudi border. The most prominent example, of course, being the Houthis in Yemen.
Right. The Houthis have routinely fired advanced ballistic missiles and drones deep into Saudi territory, targeting their oil infrastructure and civilian airports. So you have a vulnerable, oil-dependent monarchy constantly being poked and bled by a theocracy with an army of deniable proxy fighters. But the real panic inside the royal palaces of Saudi Arabia right now isn't just about incoming missiles. It's about a ticking economic clock that they cannot stop.
Let's outline that panic for the listener. Saudi Arabia knows the age of oil is slowly ending, or at least shifting dramatically as the world moves toward renewables. They know their single-pillar economy is doomed in the long run. So they have been making desperate, incredibly expensive attempts to pivot their struggling economy away from fossil fuels. They launched this massive, highly publicized national initiative called Vision 2030.
And if you pay attention to global news or sports, you've probably seen the headlines generated by Vision 2030, even if you didn't realize what the overarching strategy was. They are flashy, astronomically expensive initiatives designed to rebrand the country. They are paying unheard of sums of money, hundreds of millions of dollars, to bring aging global superstars like Cristiano Ronaldo to play in their domestic football league. They aren't doing that because they love soccer. They're doing it to buy international legitimacy, positive PR, and tourism. They're investing billions into e-gaming and esports to capture the youth market. And most famously, they are trying to build these sci-fi, futuristic desert megacities. You've likely seen the concept art for Neom, or The Line, a proposed mirrored linear city stretching for over 100 miles straight through the harsh desert, supposedly running on 100% renewable energy.
It all sounds like something out of a cyberpunk movie. But the reality on the ground is that these projects are flailing. Analysts report they are burning through cash at an unsustainable rate. Construction is delayed, and foreign investors are extremely hesitant. The economic pivot is simply failing to materialize fast enough to replace their looming oil dependency. You can't just build a mirrored city in the desert and suddenly have a diversified tech economy. It requires a massive cultural and educational shift that takes generations.
And that failure makes the Saudi leadership incredibly desperate, because if they can't pivot their economy in time, they have to protect their oil revenue at all costs just to keep the country functioning.
Which brings us right back to the threat of Iran. If Iran exerts control over the Strait of Hormuz, which is the narrow, highly congested waterway connecting the Persian Gulf to the open ocean, they threaten the entire network of Gulf oil shipping lanes. And here is a massive grounding statistic for you to absorb. When we were researching this number stopped me in my tracks. I really want you to think about what this means for a nation of over 30 million people. Saudi Arabia imports 90% of its food through those exact same shipping lanes. 90%. They live in a desert. They cannot feed themselves.
Think about the immense fragility of that reality. If Iran decides to mine the Strait of Hormuz or use their coastal anti-ship missiles to choke off that waterway, the Saudi economic model doesn't just slowly decline over a few decades. It collapses in a matter of months. They literally run out of food. Supermarket shelves go bare. When you look at it from the Saudi perspective, removing the threat of Iran isn't just a preferred foreign policy goal to gain regional dominance. It is an absolute non-negotiable existential necessity. They are fighting for their survival, and the theory argues they are willing to buy that survival from the United States at any price, whether that price is a $2 billion private equity investment or dragging the entire region into a catastrophic war.
It is the ultimate act of geopolitical desperation. It makes total sense why they would push for this. But as dark as the financial bribery and survival motives are, we have to look at the third theory currently circulating. And I'm going to warn you, this one takes a very sharp, very uncomfortable turn. We're talking about the eschatological theory, the end times. Now, I want to remind you of our disclaimer. We present theories. And while this sounds extreme, maybe even like a fringe internet conspiracy at first glance, serious geopolitical analysts and defense watchers are discussing this right now behind closed doors. Why? Because when the rational explanations for a war fail, and the financial explanations only tell half the story, you have to look at the irrational drivers.
You have to look at deep-seated belief systems. To understand this theory, we need to revisit a horrifying detail that briefly made the news cycle, but was very quickly swept under the rug by the Pentagon. 16 United States soldiers filed a formal official complaint about a briefing they received from a commanding officer regarding their deployment. The commanding officer didn't brief them on tactical troop movements, satellite intel, or logistical supply lines. According to the complaint, he briefed them that this impending war is part of God's divine plan.
Let me elaborate on what was actually documented in that complaint, because the specifics matter immensely. These U.S. troops were explicitly told that the president was, quote, anointed by Jesus to light a signal fire in Iran. And the stated purpose of this military signal fire, to trigger the biblical return of Christ.
Now, the immediate reaction of any rational person is to dismiss that as one rogue, fanatic officer who completely lost his grip on reality. The military is huge. Statistical anomalies happen. But this theory, as studied by analysts of religious extremism, scales that concept up from a single military briefing to the absolute highest echelons of global power. There's a deeply held theory that powerful, hidden factions within the government and the elite donor class genuinely believe in a radical form of Christian Zionism or accelerationism. They believe that a massive, devastating Middle Eastern war, specifically involving Israel and its enemies, is a required prophesied script to bring about the end times.
Wait, a required script? So this theory suggests they aren't treating the Middle East as a geopolitical chessboard to secure oil or protect allies, but as a literal stage play where a prophecy has to be fulfilled by any means necessary.
Exactly. And if we connect this to the bigger picture of how power operates, we have to acknowledge that there are power structures operating in the shadows that the public barely understands. Analysts point to the Jeffrey Epstein case files as a prime parallel. What those files definitively proved, beyond the horrific nature of the crimes themselves, was that vast, intricate networks of extraordinarily powerful, wealthy, and influential people operate in total secrecy. They coordinate across borders, they share immense resources, they compromise public officials, and they are driven by motives and desires that the general public is completely blind to.
It proved that the polished politicians and CEOs you see on the evening news aren't always the ones actually pulling the levers of power. There are hidden networks with their own agendas.
Right. So, applied to this conflict, it raises an incredibly important and terrifying question. I want you to consider this. What if the ultimate decision makers driving this conflict, the mega donors, the backroom advisors, the hidden factions, What if they aren't playing a game of geopolitics? What if they aren't even playing a game of money or oil? What if they are playing a game of prophecy? What if they view global destruction not as a failure of diplomacy, but as a divine success?
And this is the truly terrifying part of the eschatological theory. If the win condition for the people instigating the war is literally the apocalypse, the end of the world, then all the normal rules of deterrence go straight out the window. Military logic doesn't matter anymore. The fact that an invasion will cause severe economic devastation to the American working class doesn't matter. The fact that 78% of the public passionately opposes it is completely irrelevant to them. You cannot reason with, sanction, or deter someone whose ultimate, deeply held goal is to watch the world burn to usher in a new divine era.
You can't deter them with economic sanctions or public outcry because the destruction is the point. The chaos is the objective. It is the most dangerous possible mindset for someone with access to the levers of the world's most powerful military.
So we have these three theories trying to explain the unexplainable. Theory 1. Hubris and the blinding arrogance of the easy Maduro extraction. Theory 2. Follow the money to private equity billions, ensuring personal power, emergency mandates, and Saudi survival. And Theory 3. The terrifying, irrational pursuit of the end times prophecy. But here is the massive problem the administration is facing right now. All three of these theories, all of these hidden motives, are about to crash headfirst into a brutal, unforgiving brick wall. Because regardless of why they started the war, we have to look at the reality of the battlefield. We have to ask what happens when dropping bombs from the sky simply isn't enough to finish it. This is the ground troops trap.
This is where the grim reality of modern asymmetric warfare completely shatters the illusion of control in Washington. We mentioned much earlier in the deep dive that the math of this war doesn't work. Here is exactly what defense analysts mean by that. The United States is currently facing a massive, unprecedented munitions crisis. The military is desperately racing the clock to accomplish its strategic objectives in Iran before it quite literally runs out of interceptor missiles.
Let's explain what that means for you listening. These interceptors are absolutely vital. We are talking about the highly advanced surface-to-air missiles designed to shoot down incoming threats like drones, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles. They are the shield protecting U.S. bases in allied cities. But the technology gap between the shield and the sword is creating a massive financial black hole.
I want to share a startling piece of footage that defense watchers have been analyzing because it illustrates this mathematical crisis perfectly. There is verified footage from Israel of a recent attack. It shows a single Iranian ballistic missile falling through the sky toward its target. In response, the Allied defense systems launched 11 different interceptors at that one single missile. 11. Most of those were highly advanced, American-made interceptors, costing several $1,000,000 each. And the terrifying part that has the Pentagon sweating, all 11 of them missed. The Iranian missile hit its target.
It's hard to even process that. It's like trying to stop a swarm of aggressive mosquitoes by throwing solid gold Rolex watches at them. Eventually, you completely run out of watches, you are bankrupt, and you still have mosquitoes biting you. Tens of millions of dollars of cutting-edge technology fired at a single target, and it failed completely. This highlights a fundamental systemic flaw in how the U.S. military was designed over the last 50 years. The American military apparatus was largely built for the Cold War paradigm. It was meant to intimidate the Soviets with shiny, hyper-expensive, exquisite technology. It was built to win space races, construct massive multi-billion-dollar aircraft carriers, and fight conventional state-on-state wars. It was never designed to play a massive game of whack-a-mole, shooting down hundreds of cheap, disposable GPS-guided drones launched from the back of civilian pickup trucks hidden in the desert.
The cost exchange ratio is entirely broken. In military strategy, you cannot sustainably fire a $2 million Patriot missile to shoot down a $20,000 Shahed drone. It is mathematical suicide. You will go bankrupt and deplete your entire national stockpile long before the enemy runs out of cheap drones. And this mathematical reality is creating an unbearable pressure cooker in the region right now. Because the shield is failing, the Gulf states like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, they are getting absolutely hammered by these cheap Iranian drones and missiles.
And it's crucial to understand that these aren't just military bases being hit. Their vital, life-sustaining infrastructure is failing. Water desalination plants, which they desperately need to survive in the desert. Food storage facilities, critical energy grids, the fundamental systems that keep modern societies functioning in that harsh environment are under constant daily threat, and the U.S. air defense umbrella is proving to be leaky.
Which means the United States is going to be handed a brutal ultimatum very, very soon. The wealthy allies who paid for this influence, the Saudis who invested the billions, are going to look at Washington and say, Air power isn't working. The bombs aren't stopping the drones. Our cities are burning. You have to fix this. And the options presented to the administration are incredibly grim. Option one, according to economic analysts, is to bribe Iran to stop. Estimates suggest that negotiating an indemnity payment, essentially paying them off to rebuild and stand down, would cost around $5 trillion.
$5 trillion.
Yeah.
That is an impossible, politically suicidal sum of money. The American public would riot. So what is the other option?
Option two, send in American ground troops to physically finish the job, to go into the mountains, find the launch sites, and dismantle the regime door by door. And we already see the groundwork for this being laid. The current U.S. Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, has already publicly refused to rule out sending ground troops. The door is being left open.
But the trap springs the exact moment a single American boot hits the ground. We have to dispel the myth that this would be a quick regime change. Invading Iran isn't like invading Iraq in 2003. It is a completely different universe of difficulty.
It's not even close. First, purely geographically, you have to look at the map. Iran is 3 times the size of Iraq. It is massive, and it is not a flat, open desert where American tanks can just roll toward the capital. It is incredibly rugged, punishing, mountainous terrain. It naturally funnels invaders into choke points. It is a defender's dream and an invader's absolute logistical nightmare. Second, you are facing a massive population of nearly 90 million people that, despite internal political disagreements, is highly nationalistic and religiously motivated. In the face of a foreign invasion, analysts agree they would unify and fight to the very last person. It would be a meat grinder of unprecedented proportions, utilizing decades of prepared asymmetric warfare tactics. Every single military simulation, every Pentagon war game conducted over the last 20 years shows that a ground war in Iran would be an absolute catastrophe for American forces. It would make the insurgency in Iraq look like a training exercise.
But, and this is the sickening dark realization tying everything we've talked about together, despite a massive ground war being a guaranteed disaster for the country, for the soldiers, and for the economy, ground troops perfectly serve the personal and hidden interests we outlined in those 3 theories.
That is exactly why analysts call it a trap. Think about how perfectly it aligns with the hidden motives. A massive ground invasion gives the desperate Saudis the physical, permanent regime change they need to secure their borders and their oil routes. A ground invasion provides the intense, apocalyptic chaos and global destabilization desired by the end times believers and accelerationists. And crucially, a massive existential ground war provides the ultimate, undeniable justification for the executive branch to declare emergency war powers, suspend democratic norms, and potentially secure a 3rd term. The exact catastrophic event that destroys the country's military and economy is the very thing that saves and empowers the elite pulling the strings.
So what does this all mean? We've covered a massive amount of ground today. We've thrown a lot of heavy, complex, frankly terrifying information at you. How do the analysts synthesize this into a cohesive worldview?
When defense strategists and political scientists look at the whole board, the most likely reality is that it isn't just one of these theories happening in an isolated vacuum. It is almost certainly a highly toxic, intertwined combination of all 3. They feed off each other.
Let's break down that toxic combination. First, you have the hubris. The immense adrenaline rush and overconfidence stemming from the flawless Maduro extraction provided the misplaced blinding confidence. It convinced the war room that a military solution in Iran would be quick, surgical, and easy.
Second, you have the massive influx of money and leverage. The $2 billion from the Saudi sovereign wealth fund into private equity, the massive campaign promises and pressure from domestic megadonors like Miriam Adelson. That staggering, unprecedented wealth provided the intense personal incentive for the leadership to ignore the dire warnings of their own generals and start the war anyway. The greed overpowered the strategic caution.
And finally, the eschatological theory. That end times belief system operating within certain powerful, secretive factions provided the ideological green light. It removed the moral hesitation. If you believe the war is divinely mandated, you don't care about the collateral damage or the cost.
Exactly. Misplaced confidence, immense financial incentive, and radical ideology. When those 3 powerful forces align at the top levels of government, logic, military math, and public opinion simply cease to matter. The machine moves forward regardless of the consequences.
And to you, the listener, this is exactly why you need to care deeply about this. This isn't just distant geopolitical maneuvering that only affects talking heads on cable news. If this synthesis by the intelligence community is correct, it implies that a devastating generation-defining war has been triggered that serves absolutely 0 American strategic interests. It doesn't make us safer. In fact, it provokes terrorism. It doesn't make us richer. It bankrupts the Treasury and spikes inflation. And it severely depletes our defensive capabilities by burning through our advanced munitions. It purely and exclusively serves the personal, financial, and religious interests of an elite few. You, the taxpayer, the citizen, are paying the ultimate price for a war designed in the shadows to benefit someone else entirely.
And that leads us to the most chilling realization of this entire deep dive. The real danger here, the thing that keeps analysts awake at night, isn't just the tactical reality of the war itself. It is the terrifying fact that our institutional systems designed to stop a bad war are completely broken. Think about the traditional braking systems a functioning democracy has to prevent a disastrous conflict.
Right. Normally, historically, if a war is a demonstrably terrible idea, the system eventually hits the brakes. You have massive public outcry and protests that threaten the politician's re-election. You have the top military brass, the Joint Chiefs, issuing dire warnings and threatening to resign. You have severe, immediate economic realities like the cost of interceptors that make the war financially unfeasible. Those are the brakes.
But the scariest part of all this analysis is that those traditional mechanisms are entirely ineffective here. They are failing completely because the people driving the car do not care about the brakes. They aren't looking at the public approval polls because they are insulated by emergency powers. They aren't listening to the Joint Chiefs of Staff because they believe they know better. And they aren't worried about the astronomical cost of interceptor missiles because their hidden motives, securing personal wealth, ensuring the survival of a foreign regime, or fulfilling a religious prophecy, completely override all of those traditional rational concerns.
Which leaves us with a final, very provocative thought for you to mull over as we end this deep dive. If the traditional democratic and strategic brakes on war no longer function, if overwhelming public opinion and basic military logic can just be bought out by sovereign wealth funds or ignored by ideological zealots, what is the new mechanism for peace in the 21st century? How do citizens actually stop conflicts when the institutions fail? Are we entering a dark, neo-feudal era where wars will only end when the hidden personal and financial incentives of the global elite finally shift?
It's a terrifying question that we don't have the answer to yet, because if peace relies entirely on satisfying the endless greed or the apocalyptic prophecies of billionaires and power brokers, true peace might become a luxury that the world simply cannot afford.
That wraps up part 4 of our deep dive series. This one was definitely different, and we know it was a heavy one. We focus less on the battlefield tactics and much more on the hidden why behind the curtain. And understanding that why is absolutely crucial for predicting what comes next. In our next deep dive, we're going to be looking backwards to see the future. We will be examining historical empires, from Rome to the British Empire, that faced this exact same trap. The trap of imperial overextension, blinding hubris, and elite self-interest. And we'll look at exactly what happened to their societies and their economies when the bill finally came due. Now, before we go, a very important reminder. A huge amount of time, research, and rigorous fact-checking goes into producing every single one of these deep dives. Digging through financial disclosures, reading military white papers, and synthesizing geopolitical reports takes immense resources. We are completely independent. We have no corporate sponsors telling us what we can or cannot say. We have no hidden political backing, and we have no agenda other than finding the truth. We just follow the sources wherever they lead. If you want to support our ability to keep doing this critical, independent work, please go to buymeacoffee.com and Off the World. The link is in the description. Any amount helps keep the lights on and the microphones recording, and you can subscribe there for exclusive weekly regional updates and much deeper localized analysis that we simply couldn't fit into this recording. Subscribe, share this deep dive with someone who needs to hear the real story behind the headlines, and support us at buymeacoffee.com/world. Stay safe, stay informed, and we will see you in the next one.